be meaningful. And with that, his life is meaningful. So this book is not only about drawing, it's about the understanding of who we are as architects and how architects see the world, or used to see the world. It's about how we've moved from a world of representation to a world of simulation. And I don't mean that, computers are bad. They're incredible tools. And we walk around with these devices in our pockets, and we can take thousands of pictures, and we can do wonderful things with computers. But I think what the purpose of the book was that we can't forget those tools that really helped architects see the world differently and create differently as artists. So I grew up in West Texas, and there was an Indian legend of the great creator who, after the creation of the world, took all the trash that was left over and threw it out into West Texas. But it was really a wonderful place, to grow up. This is a painting that's something like 16 foot high and 32 foot long that sits in the Fort Worth Museum of Contemporary Art by Dennis Blagg. And I could stand in front of this painting, and I can smell the ozone. I could feel the heat on my back. I could smell the sage. I can hear the crickets singing. I am there. It takes me back to my sensory memories and gives me that cognitive impression of that place that I grew up. And the buildings that are left in West Texas, like similar to the buildings that are here, embody our history. In this case, it became who I was as a Texan and became who I was as an individual. They not only embody our history, but our cultural memory, deeply rooted in our stories, our lore, and our mythology, and how our buildings were built from the land and of the land. So what does this mean to me as an architect to draw? Recently I taught at Yale, and I called my graduate studio a land between borders. It was focused on that zone that was neither Texas or Mexico at one time, but it was full of dynamic landscapes and diverse cultures. We traveled 1,400 miles from the Rio Grande at the coast to the mouth to Roma, Texas, and to Marfa and beyond El Paso, exploring the many landscapes and cultural influences on Texas architecture. Exploring the Native American, the Spanish, French, German, Polish, Czechoslovakian, American, Mexican, Protestant, Jewish, Catholic, German, and German freethinkers. And understanding how they built of the land from brick, stone, mud, mesquite, and oak. I handed each student a sketchbook to observe and to draw and to see, and to begin to understand this relationship of man and his buildings to the landscapes in which we live. It's interesting how in today's education, in architecture, drawing is no longer required. It's an elective. And so as we drew to understand place and material, and to understand how a twisted tree becomes a lintel, and how that lintel informs the character of a building, or what it means to hold a stone in your hand, and how that stone becomes a foundation, is new to these students. Some had never drawn before. Some had never drawn buildings before, but none had ever drawn landscapes, the landscapes in which we lived before. So every place that we went, we brought these sketchbooks and filled them with knowledge, this understanding. And we brought them back to the studio and to the architectural solutions that speak to both culture and place. So my love of drawing came from my childhood. I had this Aunt Margaret, who was my godmother, And this painting used to hang in my bedroom as a young boy, and it just filled me with imagination. Where has this ship been? Where is it going? When was this? Who are the people on board? And this Aunt Margaret she was in the Watercolor Society of Houston, and this is one of her paintings. But when I was a child, like 6 and 7, she lived at the end of Old Galveston Highway. And long ago, the bridge had washed out in a hurricane. And all that was left of Old Galveston Highway was an oyster shell road leading through the swamp. And anybody thinks of swamps as just swamps. And we would walk down this road, and she would show me the cypress trees, the Spanish moss, the alligator nests, the birds, and the orchids that she would paint, and opened my eyes to this entire world of nature. When I grew up in West Texas, my dad worked for an oil company, and he had this magazine, this journal that he would get from Humble Oil, and it had these wonderful paintings in there by Buck Schweitz, who was this Texas artist, of different places in Texas, from the hill country to the coast. And these again fed that imagination of the architecture of Texas and who had lived in these houses and why they were how they were. So, what of art? Here we have a 15th century Botticelli as allegorical art. It's a palimpsest. It's layers of cultural memory and meaning erased and rewritten time and time. Memories on top of realities, on top of memories. Renaissance, on top of Florentine, on top of medieval, on top of Roman. America's identity originally was shaped at this time as Americans using European landscapes and mythologies as the basis of their art. Here we have Thomas Cole's Course of an Empire. But that would change. In 1836, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote a short book called Nature. It was the #1 best-selling book in American history. It was based on transcendentalism, that we're at one with nature, and that nature is as close to God as we could come in life. And it instructs us in every moment. This way of thinking came about in the 17th century age of enlightenment. The Immanuel Kant transcendentalism was that we can only have knowledge through the things that we experience. Human understanding is based on an understanding shaped by the laws of nature. And so this began to shape American art. American artists in schools such as the Hudson River School, where human beings and nature coexist, where poetic and artistic inspiration found no impediments, abandoning rationalism for emotion and feeling, where landscapes rise like great cathedrals into the realms of light where the deity seems to reside, a primordial image of American wholeness. The ideal relationship between humanity and all-powerful nature. Nature is God's refuge to the poet hero, and the idea that by observing, by seeing, one will know God and one will know truth. America is vast and full of possibilities, and this view of ourselves shaped a nation of brotherhood, humanity, and ecology. It showed that natural majesty during a time of American expansionism, searching for the balance between human expansion and the preservation of nature. They saw the manifestation of God in nature. Here we have Moran's painting of Yellowstone that so touched the American spirit of who we are, it created our first national park. And Acadia National Park, as an attempt to balance the industrious Yankee culture with nature. Symbolic aspects of our society, such as the tempest of the Civil War and the bridges that we would have to build once again to become a nation, became the subject of Winslow Homer's art. But it wasn't just these symbolic meanings. For Homer, it was about the seeing, a constant and obsessive search. As an intersection between the relationship between man and nature, as for many artists of this time. There were art schools such as the art colonies in Mohegan, Algonquin, and Brooklyn. And American artists carried on this tradition to the 20th century. Here we have an N.C. Wyeth, that measuring the moods of nature, as John Ruskin called it. Yeah, this, I have to stop and tell a quick story. Linda Bean was a client of ours, and one time I was on my way to our place in Vinyl Haven, and I called Linda up and I said, I'm up here, I'd love to have some coffee. She said, be at the dock at 8 a.m. sharp. And so I went down to Port Clyde. 8 a.m., I saw this lobster boat just hauling across the harbor. And just as it looked like it was about to crash into the dock, it did a perfect pivot and drifted and just kissed the dock. And there was Linda Bean in her 80s behind the wheel. And so got in her boat, she gave me a wonderful tour of Port Clyde, and then we went out to her place on Teal Island. And she showed me this painting in her front hall. And as you're looking at this painting in the front hall, you turn to the left and look out her front door, and there's black spruce ledge right out the view of her front door. It's just incredible. What was really interesting is in her kitchen, she had this little Xerox copy of a line around the island of the shore, and she had these little dots on there that had the name of a painting and the name of a different Wyeth after each one. And there were about 24 of these around this little island. So really quite marvelous. So that study of the intersection of forces where the sea meets the land, that shaped American culture. Here we have Mohegan, the Mohegan Art Colony, where we had Rockwell Kent, Edward Hopper, all the Wyeths, Jamie, Andrew, and N.C. And George Bellows, whose father was an architect. We had Edward Hopper, who saw the landscape not as a collection of objects, but of blocks of color. But most importantly, it was Edward Hopper's aesthetic strategies, synesthesia, or cross-century imagery. That ability of what Walter Wells says of artists to have us taste what we see, hear what we feel, to give colorful, odorful color to and melodious flavor, or chill wind perceived as a wailing siren or a quivering blue light. Hopper was so good at this, he was known as the poet of silence, for he could paint the loneliness of a place. What if architects could think like these artists and convey those feelings in their buildings? So John Ruskin taught us to draw is to gain an empirical knowledge, to understand through experiencing. To draw the leaf is to know the forest. And as a new generation of American architects as Americans began escaping the cities for life among nature, in the 1800s, American architects began to think this way. New England architects were among the first to design for these new rusticators. Foremost among them was John Calvin Stevens. But Stevens wasn't just an architect. He saw himself as an artist. Here we have his paint kit. He would not only paint landscapes for the sake of art, but almost as a ceremonial seeing of the sight. And because of this, John Calvin Stevens was a natural choice for Winslow Homer in designing his studio in Maine. And there's an interesting story about this, in that rather than asking for a fee, John Calvin Stevens asked Winslow Homer for a painting. And it was said that Winslow gave him a painting of his studio in the fog. So I don't know if it's this one, but it's a lovely painting of a studio in the fog. So this was so important to Stevens that he gathered other architects to paint with him. Do you sketch? There will be no shortage of opportunity to improve your skills. So they called themselves the Prussians, and there were friends like Robert Peabody of the firm Peabody and Stearns, and William Ralph Emerson, who would become the dean of America's first school of architecture at MIT, and would become known as the father of the shingle style. And Robert Peabody, designing a new generation for Americans of what Vincent Scully called America's first indigenous architecture. It's William Ralph Emerson and Robert Peabody, Peabody and Stearns. Buildings that felt as though they grew out of the landscape, built of materials of the land, wood, shingle, and stone, melded into their landscape. And I think this drawing is wonderful. If we look at the little church across the street, you notice similar elements, such as the chamfered steeple roof and the aspal end and the buttresses. And so you had Robert Peabody thinking about these sort of things as he did these drawings and as he built this building across the street. In Boston, this idea that architects should draw formed America's first architectural school based upon art and science, MIT. And Samuel Chamberlain was its first professor of drawing, where he taught, among others, Arnold Brunner of New York, who would later be assigned to the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, along with Charles Platt. Charles Platt was another artist who lived in a New England art gallery in an art colony at the Cornish Art Colony in New Hampshire, with artists like Maxfield Parrish and Augustus St. Gaudens, and studied at the Académie Julian in Paris. He would eventually change his placard from artist to architect. He developed the first measured drawings of the Italian gardens, and Platt would go on to become America's most celebrated architect and have the first monograph on American architects' work printed on him. In 1892, he took a trip to Italy with the idea of educating his younger brother, William, who wanted to work for Frederick Law Olmsted. This idea of drawing was furthered by American architectural journals, which encouraged drawing and documenting abroad. There was Pencil Points at the University of Pennsylvania, the journal for the drafting room. And its members contributed studies from abroad and at home. And this observing became the nucleus of American architectural practice. And learning the language of place was the basis of knowledge in architecture. Here we have Cass Gilbert and the seeing and the understanding. Cass Gilbert being an MIT student. And the knowing. University of Pennsylvania student John Kell, who worked alongside Louis Kahn as a desk mate. And Julian Francis Abel was the first Black American to graduate from architecture school at the University of Pennsylvania. And so this idea of building with nature began to see its way to the West Coast. Here we have Joseph Worcester's established arts and crafts movement, influenced by Jack London's Call of the Wild and his good friend John Muir's musings on nature. And it was here that Joseph Worcester would house a young architect by the name of Bernard Maybeck. And so Bernard would become a student at University of California at Berkeley. And MIT graduate John Galen Howard would become its first dean and would embrace this ideology and would take this idea of nature and drawing to the West Coast. where he would teach luminaries like Julia Morgan, the first woman to attend the École des Beaux-Arts, and Bernard Maybeck, and Mary Coulter, who defined architecture of the West with her railroad hotels for the national parks, and Ernest Coxhead, who would develop his own style of West Coast shingle-style architecture. Bertram Goodhue would find his way from New York up to Boston as well, and be befriended by young artistic intellectuals of the Society of Arts and Crafts. He would soon travel to Mexico in his early 20s and write a book, Sojourns South of the Yellow Rio Grande, where he would draw the colonial buildings of Mexico. Bertram had these obvious influences in mind with his work for the Panama exhibition in 1915, which reinforced this concept of regionalism and this recognition of culture and landscape in American architecture. And the idea that the regional identity of a place took hold with architects like George Washington Smith, who actually came to California as an artist, who also attended the Académie Julian in Paris. A funny story about this painting. I looked long and hard for this painting for my book because it's the most important artist-architect on the West Coast. And I found it, called the gallery, and they said, "I'm sorry, we can't share that information with you." And so I gave up, and it wasn't in the book. And then we're doing work in Montecito, and I had a contractor touring me around a house, and I rounded a corner, and behold, there it was. And of course, the owner said, "Oh, we'd love to have the painting in your book." I said, "Well, the book's already done." So, and Luda Maria Riggs, who did, this is actually the Maverick House in San Antonio, but designed by George Washington Smith, who helped develop the language of Santa Barbara after the earthquake of 1925. But also, there was another young architect there at the time, Lionel Pries. Lionel was a very talented young architect, but also didn't just invent this architecture. It was an architecture that was deeply influenced by his drawing and his traveling abroad. And in Mexico. And as you see here, his paintings of Mexico, that he was deeply influenced by artists like Georgia O'Keeffe and by Marston Hartley. And he would end up going on to become the director of the Seattle Institute of Art and a professor at the Architecture School of the University of Washington. So what does this mean to me as an architect? We have these phones that can take thousands of pictures, but what's the difference between a capture versus a response? What does it mean to draw it? To me, it means to absorb it into my memory and make it a part of who I am as a person and as an architect. Sometimes it's arriving in a city late night. I think this drawing was done at 2 a.m. in Venice. Very quickly, it's not the idea of doing a beautiful painting, it's the idea of the capture of the moment. Another Venice sketch, and Villa Capra in one of my sketchbooks. And here as I sit in Provence, I could feel the electricity of all of the crickets in the air, and especially remember the 104-degree temperature as I sat there and painted this Roman bridge. But it's mnemonic. It is something that connects our hand to our memory. We have Provence, a little subway station in London, the Acropolis on top of the hill in Athens from a hotel balcony, a little church in the Bahamas, And so how does this begin to influence me as an architect? You know, here's a dovecote in France and a design for a library that was inspired by the dovecote. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's not only been important to me to go out and draw buildings, but to experience nature through drawing. And so most of our projects start with that process, to understand a place. This was a drawing I did of South Padre Island in preparation for a project, of watching the sea mist roll into the dunes. Here was a sketch of a West Texas landscape as I sat just a few miles north of the border. And 30 minutes apart, two highway or border patrolmen pull up beside me and ask me, what the hell am I doing? So, this is a project in West Texas, sketching Rough Canyon, which was the house was going to back up against, and then sketching the view looking out into the West Texas landscape. And it's amazing that this view is not constant, but changes constantly with the light and the atmosphere. And then the house that was conceptualized for that site. And then the house that was realized. Here was a project in the panhandle of North Texas, which apparently looks like nothing. It's just plain and a lot of sky. Well, the client wanted a tower so he could go up and watch these great blue northers as they blew across the plain. And so we designed this tower for him, but he was smart. In conjunction with the tower, he wanted a wine cellar. That could double, of course, as a storm cellar. And so I've got Nate Holyoke here in the audience tonight. And so Nate, I had the pleasure of doing a project with Nate. And this was, we had a client on Moosehead Lake here in Maine. And this was my sketchbook, sitting on the shore looking at, the clouds drift across the lake and trying to imagine, what a fishing lodge would look like on this site. And so this was the concept for the fishing lodge melding into the landscape. Here's the view that looked out across the Moosehead Lake. And then the house as it was realized. I had the pleasure of calling Nate the other day that we just won our 8th Palladio Award, our national award for this house in Moosehead. And then beautiful trim work by Nate's craftsman, Jim Davis, in the interior. And the view looking out towards the lake. This is a project just west of San Antonio, about an hour and a half west of San Antonio in the hills. And so went out to try to figure out the best placement of the house. And, which isn't an easy task, when it's on 500 acres. So this was the house as it was realized. We decided to build a house on a bluff looking back towards the hills and connecting the forms and the materiality to the landscape. This is a courtyard, so it's more formal in its nature. The client was a big fan of South Africa, so there were some motifs incorporated into this project. But then all of the materials were local. The oak that formed the beams, the columns were actually harvested by 2 men floating 5 miles down a local river to pull them out and use them as columns. The living room. And then the living room opening up to the view that you saw was first sketched. Some of the spaces within. A cypress library. This was an impression of a site in my sketchbook for a project in Aspen, looking down Castle Creek towards Hayden Peak. And then this was one of our few modern houses, but this was the view as it was captured. Sometimes we don't have the option when our clients call and they say, we need you to come look at this site, and there's 3 feet of snow on the ground. And so you see our tracks through the snow there, and I'm trying to get an impression of the site, knee deep in snow. And this was eventually the house as it blended into the landscape. I have a place on Vinyl Haven, and I imagined what a studio would look like for me in Vinyl Haven. It would not be realized. A house in West Texas overlooking a gorge. But using watercolor as a conveyance of the vision and being able to insert oneself. I often relate this to the difference between a movie in which you watch the characters on a screen as opposed to reading a book where you insert yourself as one of the characters within a book. It's a project in Montecito, and the spaces as you move through the project. This is envisioning a sequence of moments as you move through a property, and the first building that you come across is this stable, which had Texas German influences. Sometimes inspiration comes from the funniest places. This is a cypress tree sitting on the edge of a river, just holding on to dear life with these gnarled ancient roots. And so inspired this ranch house overlooking the bluff, looking down on the river, and how it held on to that landscape in a very similar way. We get to work in a lot of different places because we've kind of been known, we've become known as an architect that can go into a place and quickly understand the landscape and the culture and disseminate a language from that. And so this was looking at a new community in Spain, and this was arriving late at night again, doing a quick sketch of a village up on a hillside. And then during the next week, designing a street for a new village, using the lessons that we learned while we were there. And then housing in Scotland, in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. This is for a little hotel in the Bahamas. And so a lot of times this process begins with what we architects call a charrette, which is a fancy word for really having to do a lot of work really quickly within a few days. And so we go in and we work with the client, and we start to form a relationship with them, trying to pull out this idea of what they see, what they envision for their project. And after spending time with them, develop a conceptual sketch. And to me, this is the language of the architect, that ability to pull something from your mind and be able to transport that onto paper. And so this was the initial sketch of this seminary in North Carolina. And then the schematic design. And as that began to develop with further drawings. The chapel. And here's the seminary. Realized we're currently working on the chapel, which would be the next phase. It's a project of the University of Arkansas. Again, that same process, pulling the concept out of your mind, getting it on paper, beginning to develop that into a real design, and then realizing that in built form. Another concept for a project in Ohio. This is the project we did for Linda Bean in Delaware. This is concept drawing, and then more developed drawings for a conference center. Sometimes it's just trying to pull a language out of thin air and develop an idea of what an architectural language could be. This is for a project in Florida. So, and then here in a place like Costa Rica, which really, surprisingly enough, has no real indigenous architecture, trying to develop one that feels as though it belongs. and that it's lasting and it's there to be forever. And so conceptualizing, what that architecture could be, and then realizing it in built form. This was for a brand new community, a new town in Costa Rica on the West Coast. And its relationship to nature. This is a project in Montana, a horse farm in Montana. Arriving up towards the lodge, which overlooks Flathead Lake, and then the view of the lodge as it looks over the lake. And then here's the stable as it developed, and a guest house. Conceptualized drawing for a church compound in St. Augustine, Florida. And so, this idea of pulling these ideas from our mind, being able to take this language and being able to turn that into something built, much like that craftsman I showed you in the beginning, who goes to bed at night, he puts his head on his pillow and he dreams of what he's going to create. And the next morning, gets up and begins that creation process. An architect must do the same. And so there's a computer that you can input information in, or if you can draw fluidly, if it's your first language, that there's no filter between your mind and your hand, you begin to conceptualize and pull these ideas out on paper. And so here's a little bit of that process for a lodge in Telluride, Colorado, and initial sketches, developing it a little bit further, understanding the site, the view, and as it developed into a real design. It's a project in California, in Pasadena, a recent project. And then I apologize for these. These are iPhone photos I just recently took, but the built house. This is a recent project we did in Mexico that was inspired by nothing more than this jumble of boulders in front of this view of the Sea of Cortez. And so, in studying the plan, this idea that we would create a house that you would go into and end up being possessed by this house, that you would enter, you would go through, you would go into, under, on top of, just like you would if you were climbing over those boulders and experiencing those boulders in every way. And this is the view towards the Sea of Cortez. This was the entry door. And then this is the view from the beach. Any of you who subscribe to Architectural Digest, this is in Architectural Digest this month. So, the front door. And as you enter into the courtyard, which is sunk half a flight below, and these fantastical forms that becomes this fantasy of vacationing in Mexico, and they entertain here, bring guests, friends and family. Tower, the master bedroom that looks out over a pool and towards the view. And this idea of moving through and on top of and within. So, some of y'all know some of my friends in the Whiskey Watercolor Club. It's a group of friends that we were sketching together and traveling together, and we all went to India about 4 years ago, and all decided to take our sketchbooks and to paint while we're there. And so we all ended up painting together and having this wonderful experience and kind of co-experiencing this incredible place through our sketchbooks and through our paintings. Trying to understand culture and history and place. But then, about 3/4 of the way through the pandemic, had gotten to a point where the president was shutting down flights back into the United States. And so we all had to rush to get our airline tickets back to the United States and get out of the country, or we were going to be spending how long on an Indian military base sequestered. So we said, okay, we enjoyed this so much, what are we going to do? One of the wives suggested, well, why don't you just get on Zoom when you go back and paint this Sunday? Well, so we did that, and we did it for every Sunday for almost 4 years. And so we would do things like, in this case, this is my copy of a John Singer Sargent painting. You have to understand the luminosity of canvas, or to look at Francis McComas and understand his use of blocks of color, or the atmosphere of Augustus Osborne Lampeau. And you can see, here's a Hug Falls by Fritz Thalo, how each of us interpret this differently, see it differently, and absorb it differently as architects. So there's 5 of us. There's 2 architects from New York City, Tom Clearman and Douglas Wright, and then Anki Barnes of Washington, DC, and then Steve Rugo of Chicago, and myself. And so it was a little bit of break, and so we all flew out to Santa Fe, said COVID is over, we flew out there. It turned out to be like a 2-week break. And so, we all painted out in Santa Fe, which was completely different for a lot of us. And we learned a lot in watercoloring in that, as you're sitting there in the middle of the desert in New Mexico, and you mix your watercolor, and you put it on the paper, and you go to get the color again, and it's already evaporated off your palette, you've got to learn how to deal with the environment. Or subsequently painting in England, where it's always wet, and you can just see the humidity just dripping off the page here. Or in Ireland, where you can see the raindrops on the actual sketchbook. So I didn't end up building that tower on Vinyl Haven. You all know what it's like to build in Maine, I guess. But I did add on a little studio to my existing house. And so this is my studio. Unfortunately, it was finished right at the beginning of COVID. And so as we started going up there and spending more time, I had this place to paint for the first time, for the fun of it, not as an architect, but just to paint. And so this is a view out of my studio window, just looking at the moss growing on the birch trees, a local quarry, a lighthouse around the corner. Beginning as an architect to understand atmosphere, to understand the qualities of light and shadow and composition and color theory, the way artists understand these things. And to begin to apply this to my work. This is Linda Bean's little dinghy on Teal Island. And here's Anki Barnes and I on my boat. We're out gunk holing and painting and different little harbors around Vinyl Haven and North Haven. But beginning to see things in a deeper, more meaningful way. Shadows and the refraction of light off the waves to the underside of rocks, or how clouds move across a landscape. So how do I apply this to my practice? I've got 30 people in my office. And one of the things we do is every Friday, we buy tacos, and we set aside 15 minutes in the back room for everybody to stop and draw. And so this has become a ritual of ours, tacos and drawing. So, everybody gets back there and they'll have like a lesson. They'll just have 15 minutes. They'll say, okay, let's study this artist's work, or let's look at this temple, and let's try to emulate different techniques and so on. And so you begin to see the hand of different individuals in our office as they develop. And learning how to see and how to convey that on paper. And then how that ends up getting transferred to our work. This is Jim Linehan in one of his plein air drawings, and then a rendering he did of one of our projects in Hocking Hills in the Appalachian Mountains of Ohio. An aerial view of that. And then recent project, as I begin to wrap up, this is a new project in Montecito, California. And this sits on a hilltop in Montecito where you have this incredible view of the ocean on one side, and then probably most importantly, this incredible view of the mountains on the other side. And you're sitting on this site and ceremonially seeing this site, as John Calvin Stevens did, and studying how it feels, what the spirit of the place is, beginning to truly understand this place before we begin design. And you see this little stone structure on the left. I'll tell you a little bit more about it here in a minute. This is the house compound as it began to develop. And then the side garden, which is all built around an old stone reservoir and the stone infrastructure of existing gardens from the Olmsted brothers. Doing some college work. This is a new project we're doing. A charrette conceptualization of trying to realize the transition into the central quad and what a building could do to that experience from the lower campus to the upper campus. And then drawing of what the building may actually look like, hand drawing. And then here you see a computer drawing. You see the lessons we've learned by watercolors applied to the computer. That was the back, this is the front. And then the ability that we have to study this building in more detail with the computer and turning it and twisting it and looking at all the different spaces. Here's a museum we're doing on the campus, an original pencil sketch of what it would be, and then the computer drawing of what the schematic design of the building would be. Computer drawings of a town center we're doing on the coast of Florida right now, that's under construction. Here's a computer drawing of a tennis pavilion in St. Louis, Missouri. But again, using those lessons we've learned about light and composition and reflected light, and just applying them through a different tool. And so here, those of you who may know architecture deeply, this looks like a William Walcott watercolor rendering. William Walcott was Sir Edward Lutyens' Maine right-hand man in rendering, and he'd do these beautiful renderings of his drawings. But in fact, this is not. This is an AI drawing. And so it's compelling, but does it connect with our spirit? Does it connect with who we are? Is it a reflection of who we are as human beings? So as I sat here in the dirt in a valley outside of Santa Fe, the sun on my back, I hear the high hawk calling, I smell the cedar and the sage, as I imagine a home that will forever marry with the spirit of the land. And that is why, as an architect, I draw. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. Yes?
When I'm looking at all your beautiful drawings and everything, how hard is it to actually get somebody to actually build it the way you want it?
Well, there's only one guy.
I mean, do you have to make compromises at some point?
Well, it's interesting, I was just telling Willie earlier today that I tell everybody in my office that from the time the concept leaves your mind, it's negotiation.
Okay.
It's diplomacy. I mean, everything you do is trying to diminish that vision from working with the city, to working with building codes, to working with the builder, to working with the client. Everybody's trying to redefine what that vision is. And a lot of our job as architects is to shepherd that vision through as closely as you can to that original vision. And it does mean a good builder, and it does mean a good craftsman, and it does mean a good client, and people who believe in that initial vision. And a lot of the part of that is not that you're selling them this vision, but it's something that they can buy into, and it's a part of who they are. That's why we start where we start, is so that it reflects who that person is, and then it becomes a reflection of the builder. It becomes a reflection of the mason. It becomes a reflection of the woodworker as he's putting it together. And in the end, it's theirs. So, it's diplomacy. It's best. You have a question?
Yeah, why has it always been, and why does it continue to only be watercolor? And why don't you personally use other things?
Yeah, I mean, I pencil draw. I guess I'm on a real watercolor kick. I enjoy the extra depth that watercolor brings to being able to see, because it involves color, and it involves understanding how color works together, understanding the medium. Yeah, I liken watercolor to driving a Ferrari on ice. You may think you're in control, but I don't know. I enjoy it. Maybe it came from my aunt. I don't know, but I enjoy it. So, and it's also part of the tradition of architects. They've always used watercolor, as you saw, to express themselves. Yes?
When did you start painting, and how did your work progress? Did you have any formal training?
No formal training. I had, my aunt, who would, let me draw in her studio with her. She bought me my first watercolor kit in high school. I took that with me to college. And so I always kind of dabbled in it. And as, different places I worked, I was known to be able to draw. And so, I did more of it. But I guess the pandemic gave me time to really immerse myself in it, right? As it did, with a lot of people and a lot of things. So there were some positive things that came out of the pandemic, I guess. Anyone else? Well, thank you all, really. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
What is your favorite?
I'll get it. I'll get it.
All right, I'm here for